To Paris, where world leaders are meeting for a global finance summit. High on the agenda is finding ways to help developing countries meet the challenges of climate change. Plus, the World Bank has announced a new plan to let countries hit by natural disasters pause debt payments. Here's more.
Overhauling the world's financial system. That is what this meeting is all about. At the financial summit taking place in Paris, world leaders are asking how a new financial system can be established and what it might look like so that poverty and climate change can be combated in developing countries.
It's clear that the international financial architecture has failed in its mission to provide a global safety net to developing countries. This architecture was built in the aftermath of World War II, and it reflects, even after adaptations, the political and economic power relations of that time.
Leaders from developing countries agree with that, saying they are too deep in debt due to the high interest rates they must deal with. And they cannot allocate funds to build infrastructure that would either help the poor or shield people from the impact of climate change.
All our effort is to manage debt instead of focusing on development. As if dealing with all these crises were not difficult enough, we also faced devastating climate effect.
For these reasons, the Prime Minister of Barbados has proposed the Bridgetown Initiative. It aims to give vulnerable countries access to affordable loans with the help of the International Monetary Fund. The Bridgetown Initiative also calls for a fund to help pay for reconstruction after natural disasters, something that would be financed by higher taxes on the oil and coal industries globally.
We do ask for everybody to share the burden so that we can share the bounty. And it therefore means that simply relying and holding only governments accountable has run its course. And what is necessary now is for us to bring to the table also multinational corporations whose balance sheets dwarf more than 2/3 of the world's states.
The Paris summit will run for 2 days, with its French organizers insisting that formal decisions need not be made here. The hope is that it will create momentum for the COP28, the world's next major climate conference.
Well, my business colleague, Stephen Beardsley, has more on the summit. Stephen, this is being called a watershed moment. Why is this so important and necessary?
Hey, Nicole. I mean, I guess it's not going to be a watershed moment until something happens, right? And right now, there's a lot of ambitions on the table. Generally, it is recognized that it is necessary to have this conversation because for one, many countries around the world right now are groaning under the massive weight of the debt that they've accrued over the past years. And first and foremost, we're talking about the pandemic. Many countries had to borrow just to be able to provide the support that their citizens needed, that their residents needed. And now they arrive at a time in which they're supposed to give out more money for climate change mitigation, while they're already starting to suffer the consequences of climate change. Think of Pakistan, for example, last year and those massive floods that happened. A lot of experts would point to climate change because of that. So this question about how poor countries can finance preventing climate change while also trying to keep their people out of poverty, essentially, this has been a thorn in the side of climate change activism and the general fight against climate change for years. How can they manage to do that while also supporting their own projects? How can they afford that, especially when they're essentially not responsible for the emissions that created climate change in the first place? So it's about fairness and urgency on the one hand, but it's also about very frank political realities on the other hand. There is no overarching body that gets to dictate who does what. All of these countries have to agree. This is an attempt to get something going. It's ambitious.
It's ambitious. It's an attempt. What could an outcome look like? What needs to change? What institutions would be affected? How would they be affected?
We know that there are, among the more ambitious proposals, there are some that we hear from Macron, for example, for things like global taxation of carbon emissions, global taxation on shipping costs, for example, emission-producing shipping. We know that there's proposals for swapping debt with promises to set aside certain natural areas for biodiversity and for climate protection, things like that. Some of these ideas range from very ambitious and unlikely to maybe that's something that could happen. And then there are more concrete proposals that have to do with multinational lenders such as the World Bank, the IMF, putting more money out there, putting more resources out there, and perhaps changing the terms of those loans as well. They're not going to give money. There are some grants, but in general, these nations behind these multinational lenders, they're not just going to pour money into these countries. Can they change the terms of the loan to make it more favorable? That's what's being pushed at in a lot of these cases. And some of these goals are, again, very radical, very ambitious. Others are more realistic. And I think, for example, we've already seen the World Bank has taken up this idea of postponing debt service for countries that have suffered a natural disaster. So in that case, Pakistan, for example. We've seen that the IMF has put more money towards special drawing rights, a kind of currency reserve that it can loan to nations. So that money is there in some senses. It can happen. Other ideas may be a little bit too ambitious.
The summit per se can't mandate anything, and anything coming out of there is probably not going to be binding. So what are the chances that we're actually going to see action?
Again, it's great that this is under discussion. We know that major multinational lenders like the World Bank have been pushing for years, saying debt is a problem, debt is a problem, debt is a problem, debt is a problem. We've seen it. We've seen countries like Zambia go under. We've seen Sri Lanka, for example, default is what I mean. And we've seen the consequences in countries like Sri Lanka of what a default looks like. So the world knows how significant this can be, and there are ripple effects down the line. So something can be achieved when we're talking about these multinational lenders, and something probably will be achieved, probably under the auspices of the G20, for example, or maybe the G7. These are major country groups that can make stuff happen because the US is involved. China's often involved in some of these groups as well. So when they work together to make things happen, then things can happen. But when they're at loggerheads with each other, for example, the US and China, look at the trade dispute there. Look at the domestic policy in the US right now with the $370 billion going towards climate manufacturing, this IRA program. Great to get more electric cars on the road, right? Only if they're produced in the US. So actually, our emissions would be reduced faster if China was included in there, but the priority is domestic manufacturing. And that's where the rubber hits the road, is you're always having to sell to a domestic audience. We've seen Trump. We know what his priorities are. He knows how to sell to a domestic audience that's very skeptical about these things. And that's ultimately what the success of these kinds of summits ride on, is whether it can be sold back home for a domestic audience that's much more interested in fighting trade wars with China, for example, or rightly for maybe reconstructing Ukraine, things like that. All of these are competing.
Yeah. That was Stephen Beardsley. Thank you so much for breaking down this very interesting and probably heated discussion-filled summit. Thank you.